Welcome to Tuesday Cafe. I'm Sean Kinane, and we are broadcasting live on March 11th from the studios of WMNF in Tampa. In the second half of the show, we're going to hear a Florida Senate committee that voted to add hurdles to the petition gathering process for giving constitutional amendments on the Florida ballot. But first, we're going to talk about the Gulf of Mexico, or as it's being called in some federal and Florida government offices, the Gulf of America. And our guest is Jack E. Davis, a Pulitzer Prize winner and the author of The Gulf, The Making of an American Sea. He will be the keynote speaker at the Florida Humanities Festival in Sarasota on March 22nd, where he'll talk about the history and the culture of the Florida Suncoast. So I want to welcome you to WMNF's Tuesday Cafe, Jack.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I'm really glad you could come on today. So, well, let's get this question out of the way. Is it the Gulf of America or the Gulf of Mexico? What have you thought about that recent controversy there?
Well, I've thought a lot about it, and it's both. It depends on one's opinion. There are a lot of people that are real happy with the name change, and there are those who are not so happy. I think I fall into the second camp. I grew up on the Gulf of Mexico. I have this lifelong in the Tampa Bay area, and I have a lifelong intimate relationship with it. And there's just something special about, writing the book was a labor of love, and there's just to me, there's something special about that name, and I love the X in the middle of Mexico, and it cast my mind back to my childhood when I thought about pirates and buried treasure, and X marks the spot, and that X marks the spot that I truly love.
So, how did the Gulf of Mexico get its name, and when did that name first appear on maps?
Well, it first appeared on maps sometime, the best of our knowledge, sometime in the 16th century or the 1500s, and it's uncertain whether it came from some Spanish official or explorer slash conquistador or from a cartographer. And it was, maps are changing a lot, particularly in those days, particularly of the New World, as more new land is being discovered by Europeans. Of course, well known to indigenous people had lived on those lands for thousands, tens of thousands of years, or 10, anywhere from 8 to 10 to 12,000 years. And and so we don't know exactly who came up with that name. At one point, the Gulf of Mexico was called the Gulf of New Spain, and Mexico was referred to by the Spanish as New Spain for quite a while.
So, you mentioned the indigenous people that lived along the Gulf. What can you tell us, especially about the indigenous people and tribes of Florida that were there before Europeans arrived?
Well, the best that archaeologists and anthropologists can determine is that people have been living on Florida's Gulf Coast perhaps as long as 10,000 years. And 10,000 years ago, the Gulf of Mexico coastline, Florida coastline, reached anywhere from 70 to 90 miles out into the present day Gulf of Mexico. And people lived out there. And along with megafauna, giant sloths, wildcats, and mammoths, and they lived off the land, but also the estuaries, the Calusa, who lived down in Southwest Florida, perhaps as far north as Sarasota, depended almost exclusively on the estuarine environment for their protein. They were sedentary people, but they were not agrarian because their food came to them by way of the Gulf of Mexico.
And what about the Tocobaga tribes? Were they lived along the Gulf as well?
Yes, they lived in the Tampa Bay area, and they tended to be seasonal residents. Some of them would stay on the Gulf year round. Others would migrate inland during part of the year to hunt and to gather fruits and other edible plants. And then north of the Tocobaga were the Timucua, who were the same, who would spend seasons on the Gulf of Mexico. The Clusa, as far as we know, are the only ones who routinely spent their entire time on the Gulf of Mexico without leaving during certain seasons.
You already talked about how the Gulf of Mexico used to be, how the Florida Peninsula used to be a lot wider. And so the Gulf of Mexico may be smaller in that sense. What else can you say about changes that have happened to the Gulf over the eons?
Well, one major change that we in Florida have benefited economically from is the creation of the beach. Our white quartz beaches are a true gift of our tourist industry is a true gift of nature. That quartz sand is actually sediment that over the eons migrated by way of erosion down to the Gulf of Mexico streams, on rivers, entering the Gulf of Mexico, being caught up in the nearshore currents, and building the beaches and barrier islands, by the way, that we love so much today. And as I say in the book, when you walk on a beach in Florida, you walk on a mountain.
On a mountain, did you say?
Yeah, because the white quartz is from the Appalachian Mountains. Years ago, the Appalachian Mountains were taller than the Himalayan, but through erosion, that white quartz, rain, wind, ice, much of that white quartz made its way down to the Gulf of Mexico to build our beaches and barrier islands.
So let's talk about the European explorers that came. What do we know about their interaction with the Gulf of Mexico?
Their interaction was mostly about trying to find something that would make them rich, gold or silver. As Cortez had succeeded in becoming quite wealthy in discovering gold and silver in Mexico, others who came to the Gulf of Mexico had hoped to do the same, to duplicate what he had accomplished in Mexico. They failed. They didn't do well. Many of them perished. A lot of people don't know that Ponce de Leon, who did not come to Florida looking for the Fountain of Youth, by the way, he came looking for his charter with the king was to seek gold, silver, and slaves, meaning native peoples he could enslave and take back to Puerto Rico. And he ended up on the Gulf Coast twice in 1513 and 1521, and engaged in skirmishes with the Clusa both times. The second time he was hit in the thigh with a poisoned dart, which ultimately took his life, which is something we don't learn about in the textbook, and many other conquistadors who followed. And Panfilo de Narvaez, who spent time in the Tampa Bay area, Hernando de Soto, they died during their explorations. They weren't not very successful. They often starved. Some were reduced to eating their horses. Some were reduced to eating each other. Yet they have among the richest estuaries in the world right before them. They just didn't know how to harvest the food from the estuaries.
I want to remind people that our guest is Jack E. Davis, a Pulitzer Prize winner and the author of The Gulf, The Making of an American Sea. This is Tuesday Cafe. I'm Sean Kinane, and we are broadcasting live on March 11th from the studios of WMNF in Tampa. So the history of the United States is really tied in with the history of the Gulf of Mexico. What are some of the ways that history is tied together?
Yeah, and that's one reason why I wrote the book, because it is very much tied into the history of the United States. But when you read the history textbooks in high school and college, the Gulf of Mexico is just glossed over, and if even mentioned. Manifest Destiny, for example, most people know about Manifest Destiny, and of course, the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. President Jefferson made his deal with Napoleon for the Louisiana Territory. Many people believe because he wanted to double the size of the United States, acquire that territory west of the Mississippi to have an area in which the United States could expand U.S. population. And indeed, he wanted that. But he actually paid double for New Orleans than what he paid for the rest of that territory because he also wanted the port of New Orleans, control of that, and the control of the Mississippi River, because whoever controlled the Mississippi River controlled commerce moving through the heart of North America down to the Gulf of Mexico and onto the Gulf Stream into markets uh, in Europe. And he also wanted the U.S. to control the Gulf of Mexico. He encouraged President Monroe, who succeeded him two presidencies later, to offer to buy Cuba from the Spanish. Cuba's at the gateway of the Gulf of Mexico, and whoever controlled that gateway controlled who came and went through the Gulf of Mexico. And Monroe made a decent, well, not Monroe, but another president later made a decent offer to the Spanish for Cuba. And the Spanish said they would rather see the island sunk at the bottom of the sea than in the hands of the Americans. And another history is the development of the commercial seafood trade in America. The Spanish operated on the Gulf for 300 or more years. The British and the French, but none of them developed a commercial seafood trade. But once we acquired Florida, the U.S. acquired Florida officially in 1821. New England fishers began coming down to the Gulf of Mexico. They had fished out their fisheries in the Northeast, and the Gulf of Mexico was ripe for the taking. And it was a very healthy environment. If you went to Pensacola in the 1880s, you would hear New England accents. And because the fish houses were operated by transplanted New Englanders. And so those fishers are really our first, what we call transplants to the Gulf South.
I imagine that histories and records exist from that time about what types of fish and the amounts of fish that people were catching. Can we can we compare what was happening then in the Gulf of Mexico from a fishery standpoint to now?
We can. Really, commercial fishery in terms of global and nationwide was founded on red snapper, and mainly by fishers out of Pensacola. But many other fish were quite popular, Goliath, grouper, and which was very popular today. Was became quite popular in the 19th century. Sea turtles, clams and oysters. Oysters are still a principal seafood today, and marketable seafood, and of course crabs and shrimp, which was a chief marketable seafood in the 19th century and is today as well. The commercial fishery in the Gulf of Mexico will, in certain years, outperform the entire East Coast fishery from Maine down to Florida. It's the most popular saltwater fishing hole in America, and that really begins in the 19th century with tarpon actually in the 1880s when the first known tarpon was caught with a fish hook, and it set the sport fishing world on fire. And that's really the beginning of our tourist trade, and a coastal tourist trade in Florida is tarpon fishing.
So, besides fishing, what other economically important aspects are there of the Gulf of Mexico to the economy of the U.S.?
Well, of course, tourism and oil. We can't do, or petrochemical industry is vitally important the to the U.S. economy, as we know, and we are the largest offshore location for natural gas and oil in the United States, but also the pulp paper industry. came to life on the Gulf of Mexico in the 1930s when the bleaching process was perfected. Paper mills grew up all along the coast from Texas to Florida, largely because of the readily accessible pine trees that went into the manufacture of pulp paper.
So I want to fast forward a little bit throughout history to environmental changes, environmental law changes that happened. Was the Gulf of Mexico and its surrounding waters, were they improved by certain environmental laws that came into being? I'm thinking maybe of the Clean Water Act and some of the other laws in starting around the late 60s, early 70s. How has the Gulf of Mexico changed because of those laws?
The Clean Water Act of 1972 had a profound impact on Gulf of Mexico waters. Virtually every municipality around the Gulf and many uprivers that sent their raw sewage down those rivers to the Gulf of Mexico were pumping raw sewage into the bays and bayous. I mean, Tampa Bay, I was, when I was a kid growing up on Tampa Bay in the 1970s, the seagrass bed, we had lost by then 60, 70% of the seagrass beds in Tampa Bay because of industrial, but also wastewater pollution. And I was lucky to be able to catch anything other than anything other than a croaker. And the only, if I got really lucky, I could catch a speckled trout. And the only bird life I saw were gulls and brown pelicans. I didn't see the stick-legged wading birds that we see today in Tampa Bay. Didn't see osprey. The first osprey I saw was in the late 1980s, and there was one nesting up near Dunedin. And we climbed into our cars and drove up there to see this wild bird we'd only heard about but had never seen. Bald eagles, we didn't see bald eagles. And those are all back now. And it's the same way all across the Gulf. We got everybody pitched in, businesses, policymakers, conservationists, volunteers, pitched in, and we cleaned those bays up and replanted seagrass beds and did a phenomenal job of restoring them. Sadly, we're slipping again in the Tampa Bay area. There's St. Petersburg is guilty of pumping a lot of raw sewage into the bay. Can't keep up with the growth. And of course, we all know about the phosphate industry and the leaky gypsum stacks. But back in the day, the phosphate industry worked hard to try to clean up its act as well. And as a result of having, the Clean Water Act, this led to the expansion of conservation groups. Virtually every bay and sound and bayou around the Gulf of Mexico has one, two, or three conservation groups working on its behalf. They're river keepers all around the Gulf of Mexico. And so yes, when Bob Graham was governor, he instituted the Save Our Coast program, which worked very effectively in helping to clean up those waters and save our rivers. And those rivers, there are some 116 rivers that flow through U.S. states down to the Gulf of Mexico. They bring that sediment I mentioned, but they bring nutrients and they bring fresh water, all of which are vital to the estuarine environment. And cleaning those up has been vitally important as well.
Our guest is Jack E. Davis, a Pulitzer Prize winner and the author of The Gulf, The Making of an American Sea. This is Tuesday Cafe. I'm Sean Kinane, and we're broadcasting from the studios of WMNF in Tampa. So all these rivers bringing down fresh water and pollutants from the Mississippi and so on has led to something that comes back every year, it seems, and that's the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. What can you tell us? What is it, first of all, and why do we see it, and what do we know about its size and its seriousness now?
So I think we have to start calling it the Gulf of America dead zone now,
Fair.
and maybe take responsibility that we should have taken years ago in fixing the problem. So the Gulf of Mexico, or the dead zone, which is one of the largest in the world, and can expand to the size of the state of Connecticut and larger in certain years during the summertime. Depending on the rainfall in the Midwest, and I say depending on the rainfall in the Midwest, that's because what goes down on the ground in the Midwest finds its way through rivers and streams to the Mississippi River and down to the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America. And what is coming down is nitrogen overload, which is creating a literal dead zone, sapping the major area of the Gulf of Mexico of oxygen that is needed to support the marine life. And so either it swims out or it dies when it's caught. So in rainy summer or rainy spring times, that means more runoff down to the Gulf of Mexico. That means a bigger dead zone. In dry spring times, which is bad for farmers, that means a smaller dead zone for the Gulf of Mexico. But we trace the origins. Now, get this. You and I are, I don't know about you, Sean, but I'm a baby boomer. And you can trace the origins of the dead zone to the baby boom, because what's happening in the 1950s and 1960s is the cereal aisle in the grocery stores is expanding leaps and bounds, and where is the grain and the corn grown for that cereal? Up in the in the Mississippi River Basin, where and then of course it's the fast food era comes to life. Where is that? Where's the meat raised up in the Mississippi River Basin? Where are those potatoes for those French fries we love grown up there as well? But a high fructose corn syrup, which goes into pre-sweetening cereal, which doesn't happen until after World War II. Before World War II, cereal was considered a health food. All of that comes from the Mississippi River Basin. And so our diet is to a large degree responsible for the dead zone.
The Gulf of Mexico, some people might be surprised to learn, actually has corals growing in them. And I'm specifically talking about the flower banks, which is fairly close to Texas, relatively speaking. What can you tell our audience about the flower banks?
Well, the flower banks are healthy, fortunately, which is we can't always say about coral and in other parts of the world, including the Caribbean. The flower banks are healthy. Nobody's quite sure why they exist there, but they have ideal conditions for them to exist there. The flower banks are heavily studied by Texas A&M at Corpus Christi and other scientists, and they're considered a real gem. But they're also a barometer for the health of the Gulf of Mexico. If we start losing that coral, then we know that the Gulf of Mexico is really sick.
So we have a couple of questions. Do you mind answering some questions that people have emailed in? I want to remind people that our guest is Jack Davis, a Pulitzer Prize winner, the author of The Gulf, The Making of an American Sea. This is Tuesday Cafe. I'm Sean Kinane. We're broadcasting live on March 11th from the studios of WMNF in Tampa. Bubba writes in, he says, naming it the Gulf of America is one of the dumbest things that Trump ever did. Why do the Chumps, he says, find such crazy things acceptable, and why is Congress so spineless in Trump's shadow? I think that wasn't as much a question for our guest Jack as it was just Bubba trying to make a statement here. Art from Largo is asking about the gold and silver that you mentioned that the Spanish explorers discovered, and he wants to know, did they originally discover them from Earth or from the ornaments worn by indigenous people? Do you know the answer for Art?
Yeah, so only in Mexico was gold and silver found in the ground in mine. But the conquistadors were hoping again to duplicate what Cortez had found in Mexico. They were hoping that Florida would produce that gold and silver, which it didn't. So it was only trinkets and ornaments in which gold and silver existed in Florida belonging to indigenous peoples. And like Panfilo de Narvaez and Soto, saw such trinkets and assumed that there might be deposits of precious metals in the area. And the clever Tocobaga told Panfilo de Narvaez to get him out of Tampa Bay, to get him away, because he brought with him, war dogs and just ruthless ways. They pointed north and said, "Go up to Appalachia. They've got gold up there," which is essentially saying, "Go up to FSU." But up to the Tallahassee area, the Big Bend area. And that's what Narvaez did, but ended up starving. And the conquistadors ended up eating all of their horses to feed themselves. Despite the fact it's mullet are running, they're on the shoreline, mullet are running into the rivers, and oysters are everywhere about, and they're starving and eating their horses. But
Well,
no gold, no
not in
gold or
Florida.
silver. Yeah.
Well, David writes in and he asks whether that the current drill baby drill mantra might affect Florida's coast and whether we might expect near offshore oil derricks coming soon. David concludes by saying, I think that having nasty tar balls and oil spills washing up on our beaches would ruin our tourist trade, but he thinks that President Trump doesn't care about that. So, do you have any thoughts about whether there's been a change in politics about accepting oil drilling near Florida's coasts?
If we go back through history, Florida has always kept oil out, and that's been by the choice of Floridians in its leaders. And we have succeeded time and time again. It seems like a movement comes along every 10 years or so. It seems cyclical that let's go ahead and drill in Florida waters, but the state has prohibited it. And has succeeded. And let me point out, it's not just the oil derricks. What would really destroy the tourist industry is the onshore infrastructure that's required to support those oil derricks. That's where the greatest pollution comes from. That's where the greatest foulness comes from around the Gulf of Mexico and Louisiana and Texas in particular. And that's what we really need to worry about. It fouls up the shoreline aesthetically with the presence of those inshore infrastructures, but also the constant, almost daily spills that come from them.
Well, Jack, those were the questions that I had, but I think if there's anything else that you'd like to leave our listeners with about the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, any of that, what would you like to tell them about the Gulf?
Well, I think I've given hundreds of talks over the years about the Gulf of Mexico, all around the country, and what heartens me most of all is how much love there is for that sea. And the folks in the Tampa Bay area um, do truly love the Gulf of Mexico, and you have to, and whether you call it the Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf of America, and you have to appreciate that, and I'm grateful for it, and it moves me to see that, and so keep loving it and keep protecting it. That's the key thing. I don't know what we have to gain from the name change. What the Gulf really needs is wise leadership to lead the Gulf region into the and through this climate change century we're in now. We're facing unprecedented challenges on the coast, and that's what needs attention, not a name change, not chest thumping.
And finally, we did just get a text from Gemini who wants to know if there are any other critters that are special to Florida and the Gulf that you think are underappreciated.
Oh my gosh. Every single one of them. I mean, they all have their place in the ecosystem, in a healthy environment, and that healthy environment factors directly into our quality of life. If it's not healthy, then our quality of life is diminished. So the one species I like to see go is the construction crane. That's one that we can afford to let to push over the edge to extinction. Let's get rid of the construction crane. It doesn't belong on the coast.
Well, Hurricane Milton tried to do just that, it seems like. Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us on WMNF's Tuesday Cafe today, Jack.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. Jack E. Davis is a Pulitzer Prize winner and the author of The Gulf, The Making of an American Sea. He'll be the keynote speaker at the Florida Humanities Festival in Sarasota on March 22nd, where he'll talk about the history and the culture of the Florida Suncoast. This is Tuesday Cafe. We're produced at WMNF Tampa, and we're going to turn